Welcome to Religious Sentiments. I'm your host, Geovanny. In today's episode, Maddie and I discuss ways in which Christians can respond to anxiety. So, what are you waiting for? Let's go. So, welcome to today's episode of Religious Sentiments. So, today, Maddie and I are going to be talking about anxiety and a Christian response to that anxiety. There's a lot going on in the world right now. It's 2020. People are worried about the economy, the whole coronavirus situation, the election that's going on, and a lot of other events worldwide.
You're absolutely right, Giovanni. There's a lot going on in the world, and I think it's pretty normal for the average American these days to be a little bit anxious. And it's a pretty normal response, but also it's how we respond to that anxiety.
Exactly. And I also just want to throw this out there before we get started that Maddie and I are not mental health professionals by any means. And please do not take our advice in the sense that you might think you can replace your treatment and prescriptions and therapy with prayer. Prayer is a supplement. Do not go off of your meds or whatever your professionally prescribed treatment is without consulting a health professional.
Absolutely.
And we'd also like to say that anxiety is a universal experience that affects people of all religions. So even if you're not Christian, we hope that you'll be able to learn something from this episode and come away with some practical advice on how to manage and deal with your experience of anxiety.
So I think we should first start the episode out with how, as Christians, can we overcome anxiety? And what does it mean to surrender to God's will?
Well, I think surrendering to God's will is a big step in overcoming anxiety. And in my experience, it has been something that has brought peace. For example, I was recently having anxiety over the outcome of the election, and I'm not going to get into politics, but I had this moment of freedom in prayer where I just aligned my will with Jesus's. Whatever Jesus wants to be the grand outcome of it all, that's what I want, whatever God wills. So that gave me a very profound sense of inner freedom, and I didn't have to feel the doom and gloom of anxiety and worry in that moment.
I definitely have to agree that surrendering to God's will can be a big step towards relieving yourself of just general anxiety. But I think it's the letting go part that is really hard, because as humans we just want to control everything, and we can't. And there's got to be some point that we just, what's the word, stereotypical saying maybe, of let go and let God.
I feel that trusting God in those moments can kind of be like being led blindfolded through a maze or an obstacle course, because you can't see what's ahead of you and you may feel conflicted as to which direction do I take. You may feel a lot of fear and anxiety in the moment, but if you just have that docility of spirit and are open to God's will, He's going to lead you the right direction, even though in the moment it may not seem like that. And something that's helped me with developing this spirituality, this idea of surrender to God's will, has actually been reading and praying this novena called the Surrender Novena. And just as a little review for any listeners who are unfamiliar with novenas, in a previous episode, we went a little into what a novena is, and it's basically a Catholic tradition of praying for a period of 9 consecutive days for either one intention or multiple. And it's basically a devotional. So with different novenas, there are different prayers that you're supposed to pray. And there are also different reflections that can go along with the novena. So it's kind of like a daily devotional in a sense. And I had never heard of the Surrender Novena until one day I found this pamphlet at church, and I don't know who left it there, how long it had been there, but it was about the Surrender Novena. And I remember around that time, if I recall correctly, I had been going through just some worry about some situation in my life. So I think I really discovered that prayer at the right time. That was really a God moment for me. And what the whole novena is it was written by this priest named Father Dolindo Ruotolo. And he was an Italian priest who lived, I want to say, around the 1950s. And if I recall correctly from my research, St. Padre Pio knew who he was. And I had never heard of this novena before, but it's basically 9 reflections that have a prayer at the end. And each of these reflections are written from the perspective of Jesus addressing you personally. So it's kind of like reading Jesus's letter to you. That's when he wrote them, he wrote it in that point of view.
Yeah.
And I've found myself just sitting down and even reading through all 9 reflections in one sitting. And when you really let that content sink in, it really does change your point of view on a lot of things. And when you practice that spirituality of surrendering to God's will, in my experience at least, it does bring peace. And we don't really have time to read all 9 reflections and go into them, but I will link in the show notes a blog post that I found on Ascension's website that has the actual reflections and prayers for the Surrender Novena. So if you're interested in that, just check out the show notes. If you're listening on a podcasting app or if you're watching on YouTube, just check the description and you'll find the link in there.
So before you mentioned this, I had no idea about the Surrender Novena, and that is something I will definitely be checking out later. So, just given current events.
Are there any other devotionals or prayers that you would recommend for struggling with anxiety?
Well, there's one that actually pops into mind, and I think a good chunk of Christians will know which one it is, the Our Father. And I think that is a really good surrendering prayer that can inspire trust when we actually look at the words.
So can you tell us a little more about that?
So back in probably middle school or even high school, we did a study on the Our Father. So it breaks it down chunk by chunk and it describes what each phrase means in just more simple words. And so then to begin, Our Father who art in heaven is we're addressing God, and then hallowed be thy name, saying your name is holy, then thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. It's like, let your will be done over ours, because we're humans and realize we're kind of silly sometimes.
A lot of the times, actually.
Okay, I was true though. Then give us this day our daily bread. So we're asking God, like, we're going to entrust you from day to day and just trust that you are going to take care of our needs and you know what's best for us, even though we may not see it in the current moment. And forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. That one's hard if you think about it. I mean, as humans, we tend to like to hold grudges sometimes. Maybe not like is a good word, but we tend to hold grudges. And when we're asking God to forgive us the way that we forgive others, it makes you really think, do you forgive people fully? Do you show them the most mercy even if they hurt you? And then finally, it's, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. So in that phrase, we're saying like we're trusting that you will not lead us into temptation, but you'll actually save us from it if we ask you.
So yes, I think there's a level of trust in that prayer, and also again that spirituality of surrender. And I even remember in one of the reflections in that surrender novena, it talked about the thy will be done part of the Our Father. So again,
Yeah.
I highly recommend that anyone listening goes and checks out that novena. It's really good. Also, another prayer that comes to mind that I see commonly quoted is the Serenity Prayer. And I'm not exactly sure who wrote this prayer because I did some research and there seems to be different opinions out there on where this originated. But the prayer is, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And I think that's a very profound prayer, especially for 2020. The first part of the prayer says, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. And if you think about it, there is so much going on in the world that is really outside of our control. And it really does no good for us to worry ourselves sick and keep ruminating and going over and over and over with anxiety over things that we literally have no control over. We just have to take things as they come and deal with them as they come, because torturing yourself with worrying over things that you cannot stop is not going to help you overcome those things. However, with that being said, there are some things in our lives that we do have the power, the ability, the responsibility, even in some cases, to change. And those things are what we should be focusing on. And again, I don't think we're focusing on as in worrying and ruminating over those things, but I think we should bring our attention to what we can do instead of focusing on stuff that we can't fix. And I really like how this prayer asks God to give us the courage to change the things that are in our control. And lastly, of course, there is a level of discernment that has to go on for us to discern the difference between what is in our control and what is not in our control. And I think with the things that are outside of our control, we have to surrender to God, to just ask Him to intercede and to trust that He will. And that even if something goes wrong in the now, in the present, that in the end, a greater good is going to come out of it somehow. So I think that's a very important part of a Christian response to all these situations going on in 2020. There's a lot of crazy stuff.
Definitely. I mean, I think 2020 has been the craziest year so far. But that prayer, that also brings me into some of the saints, that they knew that anxiety, being anxious, was normal for the average human being. And it brings me to this one quote that I think I first heard it back when Hurricane Irma came through. And Irma was supposed to be a Category 5 and wipe Florida off the map. Um, but the quote is from Padre Pio, and it's pray, hope, don't worry. And I think that's important because while it's important to continue to have a healthy relationship with God when things are going well, I think everyone has had a turning point where they turn to God a little bit more during stressful times or times that would cause anxiety, but then to have hope despite these weird times. And then just to realize that to give it the things that we can't change, give it to Him and not worry about it, and realize that in the end, everything's going to eventually be okay. And that in the end, He'll win every single time.
Mm-hmm. And I like how you mentioned hope as well. I think hope allows us to see the bigger picture. And at the end of the day, when we see the bigger picture, some of the things we find ourselves worrying about usually aren't really that big of a deal in the end. And I'm kind of preaching to myself a little bit here, because just ask my family. I'm the person who makes a mountain out of a molehill. I will go on about something and make a big drama out of it. I will get all worked up about it. And then in the end, maybe like 9 times out of 10, I go like, you know what? That wasn't so bad, actually. It was fine. No big deal. And all that suffering I put myself through was just wasted suffering. I didn't have to go through that. I didn't have to let myself obsess or ruminate. I didn't have to do that. So I do think that virtue of hope and practicing that and seeing the bigger picture is a very concrete thing that we can do in our response to anxiety.
Definitely. I am another person who makes mountains out of anthills. It's pretty bad sometimes. Then I'm not sure who the author is on this one, but there was another quote that I think you and I talked about earlier. It's anxiety is the greatest evil that can befall a soul, except sin. God commands you to pray, but He forbids you to worry. That is a really powerful quote.
I definitely do think that anxiety is one of the greatest evils that can happen to us, because it really does affect us in so many negative ways and in so many areas of our life as well. It can impact our relationships, our self-esteem, our productivity, and it can just be debilitating in extreme cases. And anxiety really is something that just can sabotage your efforts. You could be working on something, like let's say you're preparing a presentation because you're a student and you have to give a presentation in your class, and you've done what you needed to do. You've done your part, you've prepared, you've researched. But that nagging anxiety, once you start to listen to it, it'll just grow into this screaming voice in your head and it can just sabotage you. So I do definitely think that anxiety is a great evil in itself.
And what you said about like anxiety being debilitating, it's like I think when I feel anxious, it definitely affects my decisions. So even if it's just temporarily, but I can still make maybe some decisions that I wouldn't typically make had I been completely stable at the time.
And how do you think a Christian can respond to anxiety when we do what we're supposed to do in our part? We see the bigger picture, we decide to pray, to trust in God, but we're still struggling with the feelings. So, like up here intellectually, we're in the right place, but down here in our hearts, we're still struggling with the feelings. Because I think that's something even I struggle with is when I'm really anxious up here, I might be fine intellectually, but I'm still just feeling the anxiety. I'm feeling the worry. And I think in those moments, something I've learned is just trust in Jesus. And trust is an act of the will. It's not an act of your emotion. You can still choose to trust and choose to have hope, even if you feel anxiety, emotionally speaking.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything that you just said there. Trust in surrendering is an act of the will. And so maybe eventually that trust, you'll feel it, but firstly, it has to be done through an act of the will. And that's the starting point. Like I think of when I was anxious that, I would pray and I would just say, you know what, it's in God's hands now. And I wouldn't always like physically feel better after that. But it's like, I do trust God though, and that in the end things will be okay, but still feel a little bit anxious. And it's okay sometimes. So
I do think that you can have that peace of mind intellectually, but at the same time still kind of feel just a little bit uneasy physically. And so, what else do you think a Christian should do to respond to anxiety? Because we kind of went over already the whole spirituality of surrender and trusting Jesus and just, I guess, leaving it in God's hands. So, what are some other concrete things that we can do to combat our anxiety?
well, I think one of the things that we can do is look to the Blessed Virgin Mary as a biblical role model because her entire life she entrusted it completely to God. She was always perfectly in God's will, even though it may have caused some times of anxiety, like losing your 12-year-old child in Jerusalem.
For 3 days, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, for 3 days. Jerusalem was a busy city.
Even just thinking about her accepting God's call for her to become the mother of Jesus, there was a lot of anxiety that I could see she potentially had in that moment as a young person. And when you put yourself in her shoes and the whole context of the time period, if you were an unmarried woman and you were became pregnant in that time period, in that area, in that culture, that could be a very dangerous thing. So by saying yes to God's will, people might not have understood the concept of like, virgin birth and everything. So she might have found herself being stoned or exiled. So she kind of, I would say, maybe had that weighing on her mind before she said yes. But despite that, even if she was worried about those things, she still said yes. And that's what I think is so impressive about her trust, her just profound trust in God that, He's calling me to do this. This bad thing might happen, but He's calling me to do this. I know it'll work out in the end. I'm going to trust in Him. So I just think she's a very good role model for young people.
I think there's a video that I watched recently-ish from Father Mike Schmidt from Ascension Presents, and I think maybe it's a video we can link in the description bar. It was how to have joy during uncertainty. And he talks about Mary and how she didn't know what was going to happen when she said yes. She didn't know like all these things that were going to be thrown at her, but she handled it with such grace and such trust in the Lord. And I think that's something we should all look towards.
I definitely have to check out that video. So I will put it in the show notes. So for our listeners, please go check that out as well. And Father Mike Schmitz has awesome videos on YouTube. I highly recommend giving them a subscribe if you haven't already. And no, they didn't pay me to say this. I just genuinely love the Ascension Presents YouTube channel.
So I think that's all the time that we have for today. I know that this was a little bit more serious of a topic than we usually hit upon, but I think it was something that needed to be addressed, being that we're in the current times that we are. So, but thank you guys for joining us.
So yes, so I think I'm going to end in the words of Padre Pio. So despite what happens in 2020, just pray, hope, and don't worry. So with that being said, we'll see you guys next time. Thanks for listening to the show. We'd love if you connected with us on social media. Just search for Religious Sentiments on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. Give us a follow and drop us a comment. We'd love to hear from you. You can also check out the show notes for a link to our official website. Our website features our latest episodes, our social media links, information about the co-host, and our contact information. Lastly, if you enjoyed listening to the show, please leave us a 5-star review. God bless!